This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Good evening, I'm Eric Paulsen in for Marcia Cavanaugh. Informed Sources is doing something a bit different this week. With us are three journalists who have recently retired from very successful management careers in local news. We'll look back at some of the more memorable stories that they've covered over the years as, some important characters. Plus, New Orleans as a news town and what to expect in the future. Joining us is Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. And our retirees, Chris Slaughter, former news director of WWL-TV, and most recently the executive producer for WDSU-TV Channel 6. Sara, who recently retired as St. Tammany bureau chief for the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate. And Keith Esparros, who recently retired after 8 years as the news director and my boss at WWL-TV Channel 4. Before we get to all of that, we do want to talk with Errol about, what kind of a news town this is. And you really want to take a deep look at some of the things that these guys have covered.
Well, I think everybody will agree it's a great news town. If anybody has some examples, please throw them in. But whenever people in the press gather together, every year at the Press Club Awards, there's always somebody talking about what a great news town it is. And if you look at the history, if you look at the cultural history and just the mix of people that walk the streets here, a town of pirates and Civil War veterans and all kind of different characters. There's so much to it, and the Spanish culture and the French culture. And there was a time that there were newspapers all over town in different languages. Yeah. And so it was very versatile. It was really one of the early towns to get television coverage. It was really that, and then with the newspaper coverage, and so there's always been stories to tell. It brings to mind. There was a book that came out a few years ago about Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Great book. It was about a murder that took place in Savannah, and you read the book, and there were just all kind of side stories about the social life in Savannah and the cultural life. And it did really well. It was a big seller. And I remember meeting the author, asking, well, why did you do a story about, there's murders all over. Why'd you do one in Savannah? And he said, because Savannah is a town that people care about, that they know about. A lot of people have traveled to it. And even if they haven't traveled to it, it's one that they're feeling. And I think that's what New Orleans is too. It's a town that people care about. There's a lot of things to be concerned about, but it's such an historic town, and so many people would have traveled to it. If you hear about an incident that happens in Venice, you're going to react more than if it happened in Genoa. And
I've worked in both Savannah and here in New Orleans, and New Orleans is a smaller town, but it's like a big market news town. You think of the stuff that's going on here all the time. It's either politics or a storm or crime or whatever. We always have something going. There's never a dull moment here.
Yeah, unfortunately, not all the news. In fact, it seems like any of the news is good, but there are just so many angles to it. And there was a time when New Orleans was associated with the mafia. Yeah. That's part of the angle. So just a lot of stories that come out of this town. And so for the people who cover it, at least have a good base of stories here.
All right, and Chris, and I've worked with both these guys. Many years ago.
Many years. And currently.
Yeah, that's true.
Recently.
And I do want to talk about some of the things you remember about the news business, some of the more memorable characters, things like that.
Well, story-wise, I think it would start with when I was back in the late 70s. One of the first big stories, and unfortunately, a lot of them are tragic, but this was a Luling Ferry disaster. Yeah. And I can remember working on that and coming in and saying, wow, this is, a big deal. But it was just the beginning of many. In the 80s, you had basically the first surge of violent crime and, crack and stuff like that beginning to come along. One of my big stories that we worked on in the 80s was in the 90s was a two-lane scholarship situation.
Yeah.
I remember that. That started where we got a single phone call from a guy who says, look, I got a problem with something that happened last night. He said, my son was at an awards ceremony, and the mayor of New Orleans gave his son the mayoral scholarship to Tulane University.
And we didn't even know those scholarships were being given out like that.
That's right. And not only did the mayor have one, the council people had one, and legislators had one. And it was for a full ride.
Yeah.
You know, and nobody that we knew, so we said, you know, what is it? And they said, basically, you know, Tulane did that, quid pro quo, obviously. And so we started checking on it. And, you know, we reported on it. And one of my favorite times on it is we put in public records requests for the entire legislature, for every legislator to give us a list of who they had given their scholarships to. In a lot of cases, they were trading them out.
Yep.
Like a guy from South Louisiana would give one to a guy from North Louisiana, and they would put their own kids through school. But two of my favorite responses, one of them was from I guess he should be unidentified councilman, who, when Dave McNamara, who did great work on the story, asked him, well, Councilman, were you the most needy person in your district? He said, well, I thought so. Okay.
Sounds like an Edwin Edwards comment.
Yeah, and then a U.S. Senator, former U.S. Senator, we asked him about his son getting the scholarship from him, and his initial reaction was, I don't remember where my son went to college. So I said, well, that's a good story there. And then, you know, some of the elections, like, you know, with Sydney, and then fast forward to, of course, the biggest thing I think all of us covered at some point was Katrina, of course.
Yeah.
And, you know, the actual arrival of the storm wasn't that significant. I remember that morning, a bunch of us, we had been over at the Hyatt. We went down and we were over at the Hyatt trying to talk to, you know, stay in touch with city officials. And I think you and some other guys had gone to Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
And so we had, you know, crews spread out, operations spread out. And we went back to the station. And on the way back to the station, it didn't seem like an unusually bad situation.
Actually, we thought we had dodged the bullet. It
Yes,
took
yes,
a
we did.
jog to the right.
So I remember going in and writing up on the bulletin board on where we put our stories, 17th Street Canal. And so we started sending crews out. And when we went back in, the phones were working, the radios were working, the lights were on, everything seemed fine. But then all of a sudden, things started getting quieter and quieter. The phones quit working, the police radios stopped. We had to go, you know, on full generator power. And then, but our radios still worked. So I remember calling the cameraman who we had sent out to the 17th Street Canal and, you know, asking, what do you see out there? He said, I can't get there. And I think that was the point where in Baton Rouge, Bill Capo interrupted you guys on the set.
Yes.
And gave that.
Because we were broadcasting from Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
And that's a turning point in, I think, every New Orleanian's life. It's pre-Katrina or post-Katrina. And Sarah, you've covered a lot of big stories in your time. Give us some of your recollections.
Well, I will say certainly Katrina was a big story, but kind of like in the last 10 years, which is when I've gone back to covering news, there's just been this wave of corruption on the North Shore, in a place where people kind of thought that maybe they were just a little bit better than their neighbors to the south, a little bit better government, better.
But we had all heard stories about corruption on the North Shore, but we didn't realize how deep it ran.
Yeah, I mean, in 2013 it started coming out about our coroner, Peter Galvan, and it was followed by our district attorney, Walter Reed, and then most recently by Jack Strain, the sheriff, and all three of them went to jail, and Jack's there for life because what started as a corruption story.
He's there for two life
Really?
Actually 4, but anyway, you only get 2. I mean, you only get 1 life. But at any rate, you know, his turned out to be sort of a criminal case.
And a bizarre case. That was such a bizarre story.
Certainly. And I think the other thing that came of that was sort of this, now there's this real distrust of local government that's just palpable. I mean, taxes are having trouble getting passed. People don't want to, a lot of incumbents turned out of office just because of this sort of malaise and this idea that we can't trust our local government. So I've seen that. And now lately we've got sort of a culture war thing going on. It sort of started with it started with Common Core and parents weeping at school board meetings about how awful it was, and then mask mandates, all kind of from an ideological perspective. And now we're seeing it with our libraries. So it's it has always been conservative since I've lived there. I've lived there for more than 40 years now.
But it's gone ultra conservative.
But it's gone
now.
kind of and kind of militant, if I can use that word. Sort of a really there's a lot of civic activism that I didn't necessarily see, but it's kind of tilted right, I think.
Yeah. And now, Keith, I started working with you at the time of the World's Fair here in New Orleans in 1984. I worked with both Chris and you. I was the weekend anchor at the time, and you guys were my 6 o'clock producer, and you were my 10 o'clock producer.
Indeed.
And we covered a lot of stuff then. A lot of stuff was happening.
No, we did. As everyone now knows, it turned out to be a bit of a disaster. It kind of always never really took off, and then it went from not taking off to just sort of crumbling, and then it became sort of a black eye on the city. It got a lot of national coverage as to what a failure it was.
But it was a wonderful fair.
It was a very nice fair. It's just nobody came to it, and of course it was during the worst part of the year. It was during the summer, and it was an outdoor event, and that may have had something to do with a little of it. But what has happened since then is it's led to this great redevelopment in a part of town that had been, I don't want to say neglected, but it was certainly not open to the public.
It was a warehouse
public
district.
friendly. It was a warehouse district. So I think looking back at it, it turned out to be a positive for the city. If I'm not incorrect about this, I think there was only one other World's Fair that happened after that.
Knoxville.
Yeah.
And that was it. There's like they had run out of favor.
Yeah.
That was really the end of World Fair.
It was.
After that became the example, and people saw that it's not the same anymore. People don't need a fair to explore the world anymore.
So, but when we talk about big stories, and I want to bring up two, because they're a little bit of yin and yang of each other, but one of them was, of course, Flight 759.
Yeah.
So July 9th, 1982, that date sticks in my mind, and I'll never forget it. And just how quickly that sort of tragedy can happen, and how terrible that was. And we went back not too long ago, and was it the 40th anniversary of it? And you went out there and talked to some of the folks that are still in that neighborhood.
And the lives it affected, and I mean, it tore through that Kenner neighborhood.
And how it changed aviation after that. Then all of these warnings, these weather systems were put in to stop that wind shear, or not to stop it, but to be aware of that wind shear.
And excuse me if I can butt in, but we were talking about characters too, and I think for all of us, probably one of the biggest character in this state was Edwin Edwards.
Oh, God! But before I get to Edwin,
Oh, sorry.
And as terrible as 759 was, just a few years later, there was, I think you know where I'm going with this, there was the TACA flight, where this flight takes off, or coming into New Orleans. I can't remember if it was taken off or
coming in.
Coming in, right.
And it loses both engines. Two-engine jet, loses both of them. And the pilot pulls off a dead stick landing on a levee in New Orleans.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
And no one is hurt. This is a plane that's falling out of the sky, and this guy pulls off, which we had been told by other aviation experts was a 1 in 10,000 chance of pulling this off. The guy pulls it off, but my colleague here is on the assignment desk the afternoon that this happens, and the phone rings. He knows where I'm going.
Should I take it from there? Or?
Would you like to?
You can finish each other's sentences.
You can, and then I'll correct you.
I can interrupt you. It's okay.
Yeah, all right. I'll tell them the truth.
So a phone rings. I was eating a spinach salad.
Jeez. All right.
He's going to go in a lot of detail.
No. So I get a phone call, and it's obviously an elderly woman. Mister, do you know anything about a plane crashing in New Orleans East? I said, what do you mean? She said, I saw this plane, and it went down below the trees, and it didn't come back up. I said, well, was it a crop duster? She says, oh, no, it was a big plane. I said, oh, okay. I said, where? And she told me. So I said, well, we don't have a lot of time. So I call a tower at Moysan Airport, and I asked a guy, I said, identify myself. I said, do you have a plane down in New Orleans East? And there's a long pause, and he says, yes. I said, well, do you have a location on it? Is it in the water, on land? He says, as far as we know, it's on land. Goodbye. And he hangs up. Okay. Then we get another call that says, meet you at the facility. So long story short, we ran out there. So sorry to interrupt.
And as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, it was a one-eyed pilot.
Yes, it was.
Because there'd been some kind of shootout in an airport in Central America or something,
Yeah.
and he got hit in the eye.
And the crazy thing is that was a Sully Sullivan moment, but there was no social media, and so it didn't get the publicity that Sully did.
No, and probably, from what I understand, probably tougher to pull off.
Yeah.
What this guy did, and but it's just the joy in that, as opposed to what had happened a few years earlier in Canada.
I mean, the people being reunited with the pilot, the passengers, was just terribly moving video in a good way.
And one of the flight attendants comes out of the plane. Now, okay, imagine what has just happened. And it's still raining, it is storming. And this young lady comes out of the plane. Marion Lanassa, he's got a video camera, and this is, I forget what year it was, but he's shooting this thing, and he asked, what happened? Tell me about it. And she just very calmly says, we had to land on the levee. Like, really? That's your summation of everything that just happened to you? But it was a remarkable story.
I remember when we finally got the cockpit voice tapes. Do you remember what one pilot said to the other one? They land and they take a deep breath, and one of them says, aren't we a couple of crop dusters?
And I didn't. We still got to get to Edwin Edwards. I mean, he's had such an influence on this state, and he was a true character.
Oh, absolutely. And what occurs to me more frequently now is look at Edwin Edwards and the way he handled the media, and the way he talked about when he was asked, "Gee, Governor, it sure looks like a lot of state contracts go to your friends," and of course his answer was, "Who do you want me to give them to? My enemies?"
And he'll always say, "I had a lot of friends."
but look at contrast that with the way the current mayor deals with the media. This completely adversarial approach she has to the media, as opposed to how Edwin dealt with the media in almost as a partner, maybe not a favorite.
Well,
partner.
you talk about apples and oranges. I mean, he was so quick and he was so sharp, and he was the darling of the media. And if I can segue into what do we see as the future of the news business, because it has changed. I mean, some things for the better, some things for the worse. Sara. Anybody?
Well, how has it changed? I mean, people can write their own stories now, can't they?
And newspapers are having a hard time surviving all over the country.
That's true. That's true. When I started in 1980 on the North Shore, there were like 3 or 4 newspapers just in Slidell, which is unbelievable to think about now. And we had the Times-Picayune had just made the incursion into the suburbs, realizing it was a great target for advertising and for readers. And we had a fully staffed bureau on both sides of the parish, and then it kind of came down to just maybe me by myself with and a community news writer. So yeah, I mean it's shrunk, and yet the demands are not less, because now we want 24-hour coverage. We want something up within minutes of it happening. And so there's not as much leeway to kind of take a step back. That's one thing newspapers still try to do, is take that step back and give the fuller picture.
But when I said good for the bad, I mean, before, newspapers were big, TV, local news was huge, and now we have, it seems like everybody with a camera thinks they're a reporter. Yeah,
it's true. And we're going to have to deal with the social media. And, a few years ago, we sort of embraced it, because we felt that was a different distribution point. We could reach audiences through these other ways. Now, social media is so full of lies, distortion, misinformation. I think we all need to look back or to take a step back, rather, and see how much do we want to be a part of this.
Because people used to trust the news.
There's no discipline. There's not the traditional discipline. You can say anything you want about somebody without having to check facts. Facts, what are those? And they can be pretty dangerous. I wanted to mention about the media. Look what the Advocate, or Gorgeous Media Group, did last week. They announced the formation of I guess, a new publication, the Shreveport-Bossier newspaper. But it's not a newspaper, okay? It's a website. And, you know, you read, I mean, there's a shortage of news coverage. But now it's not uncommon. Every news operation has a website, but usually there's the news operation first, then the website, okay? Here's the website with no new regular news operation. I think they're going to have 10 reporters. But also part of the announcement, if they're affiliated with some sort of charity group to help raise money. You're seeing more and more of those kind of things about supporting investigative journalism.
We had a big investigative journalism push, and we got a lot of people we're getting money from Microsoft for our rural affairs reporters. I mean, there is more of this sort of public-private kind of money in it. In Shreveport, Gannett had one reporter for Shreveport, one.
Yeah.
So you know, it's too expensive to try to print up there. But you know, I know some people make them a little nervous that maybe that's the way we're going. But just remember, the Times-Picayune in 2012 decided we should go that way, and
Well,
you know,
but think
in
about that.
all places, New Orleans, where
right,
people
really.
love their
You know,
traditions.
one of my concerns moving forward, to me it's a mixed bag, is obviously the commercialization and the intrusion into news, but other is the thinning out of a story.
Yeah.
I mean, we're getting in now where stories are, you know, we used to take pride in doing a 130, 2-minute story, real thorough. Now things are pushing quicker to 45 seconds, et cetera, with a lot of repetition. And I think that's bad.
And the audience has changed for newspapers. I mean,
Right.
circulation is way down. Viewership is down because people can get things online.
Yeah, now moving forward, I think, as you were speaking about the investigative, this is a great time for investigative journalism, always has been. I mean, for the longest time, I mean, you look at the guys who have come through the paper and TV, et cetera, and you know, now Lee Zurich, who's got a national profile from his work, and, you know, the guys I worked with, Travers, et cetera, David Hammer at WWL, I mean, really good investigative reporters. And I think that's going to be one of the things that really keeps local news going strong.
And here's my caution on that, and not that my opinion matters on this anymore, but right now, investigative is valuable because it's new. You can't have read it until we tell you about it because it's our investigation. But I think what is happening now is we are all saying everything is an investigation. I pull one public document and look at it.
Yeah.
I'm branding it an investigation. So
It's like everything is breaking news.
if everything is an
I agree
investigation,
with that.
then nothing is an investigation. And I think media going forward needs to, you know, before they screw up that brand and the value of investigative, got to be careful.
I got to watch the clock. As we close out, we want to ask everybody some of your more memorable characters. Errol first. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, we've mentioned Edwin Edwards, and then, yeah, I think he's staying out as the one. Both, you know, he accomplished a lot.
He did.
No, I mean, when he died, he was a great source of quips. I mean, you could tell Edwin Edwards jokes all week. But you look at the, actually, he came in and helped save. We were talking about the World's Fair. He came in and helped save the World's Fair. I remember the people were desperate, you know, for Edwin Edwards to get in and building the arena, and so he was very good at it. You know. He walked a tightrope. He could have been like a great national political leader, or he could have been a guy who kind of fell over, and he fell over. But I think another person that needs recognition is Tom Benson, what he did. And I remember Tom Benson told me one time, at the time when the original owner, John Meekum, was going to sell to Saints, they didn't have a buyer. And Tom Benson said he got a call from Edwin Edwards to go to Baton Rouge. He says, I have a group of people together, talk about buying the Saints. So Benson, he went up to Baton Rouge. He says, I was the only person he had, okay?
Yeah, we loved him then after Katrina, when he thought about moving to San Antonio, he wasn't so popular.
Yeah. Well,
But Gail Benson has really been, really...
Here you have a car dealer and someone who was an interior designer who've taken that whole thing and they've built it, and just the contributions to the community.
Well, they're not going anywhere. Sarah?
Well, I'm going to have to say Jack Strain, the sheriff who who went from being this corpulent, bumbling Bubba type, known as Boo Boo in Abita Springs, to being really powerful political figure. 20 years as sheriff, had this amazing plummet from grace because not only did he skim money with the work release that got him into trouble with the feds, but Katie Moore and I pulled on that thread, and it turned out he was also a child sex predator. So the thing that makes it so interesting to me is is that none of us had any idea that he's
No.
sort of this mysterious figure that, that led literally a double life.
And you wonder how that could have slipped under the radar for so long.
With all these cops around,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's really, to me, that makes, the fact that there's a little bit of a mystery there makes him interesting to me.
Chris?
Oh, for me, it's J. Michael Early, who, as the general manager at WWL, really created a juggernaut.
He was
so
a
to speak.
titan in the business.
Yeah. And Phil, he and Phil just really built
Johnson.
this. And then working with, top flight journalists, I'll give you that one, Eric, you were one of them. And, Bill Elder, Eric Paulsen, who I said, Angela, Garland Robinette, a couple of those guys. And just, in my formative years working with those people really helped me move my career forward. And it was just, it was learning from the best. And
Yeah.
I think, without getting too moldy or sappy, it was a golden age that journalism really came of age in this town.
I agree. And I'll always put you two together because, when I came back
Right
from
with
a
me,
show
bro.
called PM
Yeah, bro.
Magazine, you guys were my guys,
Yeah.
Keith?
Just for pure color, Harry Lee.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
How can anyone get away with everything he said and be as beloved as he remains to be? I think Harry was just a walking soundbite machine. While Edwin was clever, Lee was blunt. And, and they both worked, apparently.
Well, and how many sheriffs had a bobblehead, So
Exactly. Which, of course, is the sign of success.
it is.
Right?
Well, and a statue.
I'm waiting for yours.
And who sang at his own country and western bar, too, right?
Well, and then they had the Fado and, all kinds of stuff. He was very tight with Edwin.
Oh, absolutely.
There's no shortage of characters.
Let me throw out one more if I can. This is Dutch Morial.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's important. One, because he was the first black mayor, and so he helped in that. But right out of the gate, first of all, he had the flood, this big urban flood. But then building up with the police strike, and his handling that police strike was a heroic moment. And a lot of people were wondering how it would stand, like with the first black mayor against the police, and that the white community would be behind the police, not the black mayor. But it changed, okay? And ultimately, he got the support. And I think a really historic moment was when all the crews stood behind Morial and said, we're not going to parade. We're not going to be held hostage by the Teamsters Union. And I think that moment, Morial, first of all, appreciated the crews and appreciated that support. And it was a critical moment. I mean, if they would have lost that strike, the city would have been in trouble. But then from that, you had Mark Morial, and you had 16 years of Morials. So he was a critical figure.
Yeah, and we could go on and on and on, but
Indeed.
we're out of time.
Okay.
And that's our show for tonight. Marcia will be back next week. Hope you enjoyed the program. We'll see you back next week.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.